Hi, Wunling, can you hear me?
Yes, you want to start, CK?
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, hello? Can you all hear?
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
Yes, we can.
Roger.
Loud and clear.
You good, CK?
Can you all hear me? Can somebody respond?
Yes,
Yes,
we
me, is it?
responded
Yes,
quite
can
a few
hear you.
times.
Can you hear us?
I think that's the relevant question.
Okay, I shall start. Good day, everyone. Welcome to SIA United Care and Share webinar series. Today's topic is sustainability beyond COVID-19. And the talk will be presented by Sustainability Committee Chairman, Hann, and the committee member, Benjamin. Today, I would also like to especially welcome our friends and guests from Acacia who take time to join us today. And after today's talk, we also will have a official launch of SIA Green Book. Will be officially launched by our president, architect Szue Huang. I think without much further ado, I will then pass the screen to Hann. Hann, please.
All right, thanks, CK. So first of all, welcome and thank you for attending this session. I see SIA Council members. Thank you so much for being here. And also a couple from the SIA Sustainability Committee. So a little bit of background while I try to get the screen shared. So basically what we've been working on during Szue Huang's term, while he's president, is the 7 guidelines for sustainable architecture, right? You might be able to see the screen now. And this is an endeavor that has happened in the past 2 years. And what we've tried to achieve is to come up with a series of guidelines for architects in tandem with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in order to achieve what we feel would be a good parity between advancing construction and also maintaining planetary and human health. Yep. So along the way, we've been supported by many of whom are in this room as well. And my co-speaker for today is actually Benjamin Towell, who actually, apart from his day-to-day work as policy making in BCA, he's also contributed tremendously to the Sustainability Committee, not in the least of which actually authoring the Green Book, which we'll be launching today. Yeah, so he'll share a bit more on that later on. The reason for the talk today is also to find out, how's everyone coping with COVID-19, and what does that actually mean for the longer term sustainability, not just of the planet, of course, but also of the profession. Yeah? So it's become quite clear that we need to start operating in tandem with the environment, with the planet, and also with the longer term goals for sustained economies and sustained health. So a lot of that has to do with the long term, of course, and a little bit of that has to do with the ongoing global pandemic and what that has taught us, during these times. So you would have heard many feel-good stories. We all need these feel-good stories these days on how the earth or the in this case wildlife has started replenishing and started reoccupying our cities once again. Our beloved otters. There's deer that's running in. Some are fake images you see online. I think the dolphins in Venice were fake, but many, of course, are real. And it is true that human activity is the main cause, of course, of failed ecosystems. In this case, Los Angeles, carbon emissions are falling sharply. I think in the month of April, there was a 6% decrease over the equivalent month without a lockdown. And thanks to COVID-19, in this case, in the Trending Science article, it is time to flatten the curve on climate change as well, right? And there's also, of course, the factor where COVID-19 and climate change is precise, because you would have global leaders or you would have the powers that be, unfortunately, denying the problem and then basically going, hey, our economy is more important, and the solution in this case for COVID-19 is either too restrictive or too expensive. And likewise, the discussion on climate change, right? And not to mention consumption. I think there will be a poll question for the audience later on, right, on what your consumption habits are during this time. But food delivery services, obviously, a whole bunch of plastics are excessively being consumed, right? And likewise, I think our habits of online shopping maybe would also have increased during this period, right? So I think a lot of governments, I'd say, have taken on the flattening the curve response rather than the herd immunity response. And the idea is putting measures in place such that the number of cases over time would better out and also be less stressful on healthcare facilities. And well, you've heard of flattening the curve for COVID. What then about climate change, right? If we continue business as usual, I think the impact or the negative impact of climate change would be high risk and of course, highly significant, right? Whereas acts that are put in place or goals that are put in place, including the UN SDGs as well as the Paris Agreement, would hope to actually reduce that over time. In this case, from a 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature across 2 centuries to a 2-degree increase. So I won't go through all these points, obviously. You've had enough bad news for the week, I would imagine, right? But these are the scenarios that we're facing up if such behavior or what we're actually doing continues to be unchecked, right? So of course, rising global temperatures, water access, natural wildlife in terms of fisheries, what we're doing with waste and consumption, and specifically for architects, you would have heard, of course, that buildings consume up to about 40% of the world's energy consumption. And what more, it's construction, right? So concrete is arguably the most destructive construction material. So if you may or may not have seen this diagram before, but for me, I think it's a good way to summarize what we're actually doing to the planet. Right? So this is the planetary boundaries model. It's not authored by SIA. It is a model that we looked at from Stockholm. the guys who brought you the Stockholm Syndrome. But they've also come up with this model where there are 9 different sectors of what damage we're actually doing to different aspects of the of ecology of the planet, pretty much, right? So you hear about climate change a lot, and to be honest, well, we do as humanity, we do know what we're actually doing to the climate, right? So the risk is actually still quite low. Surprise, surprise. What we don't know are other factors, right? For instance, stratospheric ozone depletion, right? Sorry, that one is fairly managed, or atmospheric aerosol loading, for instance. Right? We're not sure how much, what the quantities are, and therefore what the risks therefore are. And those that we do know, for instance, genetic diversity and biogeochemical flows, where we continue to put phosphorus and nitrogen, even with biodegradables, back into the soil and back into the waters. Right? We are negatively affecting geochemical flows, obviously. Right? And it's gone into beyond the zone of uncertainty. And when that happens, we are closer, in this case, to a tipping point. And when the planet, of course, experiences a tipping point, it starts all over again, right? And a model that actually maps onto that, again, not an SIA model yet, right? But something that we referenced quite extensively is from an economist called Kate Rayworth. And what she proposes is that the safe and the just place for humanity would be within, in this case, a donut, and that donut forms, or rather occupies the limits of the social foundation below which life becomes untenable, and also an ecological ceiling beyond which planetary health becomes untenable, right? So what then what kind of role would architects play in that? What kind of role could we actually put in place to ensure that, first of all, planetary health is maintained while we continue contributing to the economy? Right? And what then of year-on-year growth? So the Sustainability Committee in SIA focuses on the larger picture issue, which is what we're doing to the planet, and how we can basically distill and condense that into guidelines. The exercise initially was to come up with guidelines, and then naturally the idea of a green book came up, and that green book would be an extension, or well, I would say a revision, or a new way of looking at what used to be the 11 attributes for sustainable practice in architecture. 7, we hope, would be an easier number and easier to remember, but also 7 habits of effective people and so on, right? So anything beyond 7, I struggle to remember. These 7 were actually derived from 17, which is even harder to remember. The 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which came up about maybe 5 years ago, right? So there are things, and let's be honest, there are things as architects we cannot even fathom to conquer or to change, right? One of which is hunger. Another, of course, is poverty and gender equality. As much as we can encourage, workplace gender equality, it is tough to solve these on a global scale. What we can, however, have a direct impact in is, of course, in terms of energy consumption, sustainable cities and communities, innovation and infrastructure, and of course, habitats on land and in water, right? Climate change, of course, being the underlying theme, or the underlying factor. So the next few slides will be an introduction of the 7 EDGs, right? The book that we're launching today will, of course, describe these in greater detail. But as far as practice is concerned, there are aspects which are applicable to the design process, as well as, in this case, the construction process. So education and integration, basically the architect taking a lead role in educating the client and the team on the potential impact on the environment, right? So with every one of the EDGs, we also have metrics and measurables, which are how we would quantify the impact of this particular guideline. So the icons that you see here are references from the SDGs. So education and integration, of course, takes into account SDG number 4, quality education, and partnership for the goals. An example, of course, is the book that we're launching today. We hope this, while it's not mandated, not yet anyways, right? We hope that this will become a suitable guideline for how we can actually practice in a more sustainable fashion. And it's not just for the planet, right? It's also for our own health and wellness, and the ongoing sustainability of the profession, right? So I'll focus a bit more on SDG, or EDG, sorry, number 6, right? Health and well-being, given the COVID context. Another example of a project that I worked on in education and integration. So this is basically a prototype lab. It actually rotates, and what it does is you could actually apply new technologies and new materials on it and subject it to real world testing, right, with the appropriate sensing and so on. Right, so that could become a guideline again for how materials and so on can become more sustainable and be employed in the industry. EDG number 2 would be climate action. So this is, of course, a broad address of climate action. So how we basically narrow it down would be through looking at metrics like low carbon, right? Life cycle assessment, part of which is also required these days in the Green Mark and LEED accreditations, as well as things like global warming potential and PM 2.5. Right? So these will, over the years, become even more defined in terms of quantities. And as a guideline, it would make reference as well to the prevailing guidelines that you already have to deal with, right? So it won't be over and above. An example, of course, would be a master planning project in this case, where we set parameters for energy consumption, for water savings, and so on. And on a more meso or a micro level, looking at the architecture and how that could actually respond to the needs of, in this case, renewable energy, as well as physical distances between buildings, right? So guidelines literally on how you would space your buildings apart and what a sustainable master plan could then be. Another example in this case would be a data center, which uses natural air cooling because of a cooler ambient air temperature, given its locality, in this case, in Bangalore. Right? So looking at ways of, in this case, adapting with nature, not just mitigating its effects, but also adapting to it. SDG number 3, natural capital. So this is clear and obvious. It's basically the employment of natural landscaping and the encouragement of natural ecosystems as well. Right? So the examples again would also be clear. Green plot replacement, bringing greens back up into buildings. Right? However challenging or however effective that might be, it would be worthwhile also looking at its impact on the urban heat island effect. And not in the least, biophilia as well, as you look out into greens, and it helps your mental wellness, as it were. Resource management, EDG number 4, basically looking at water, sanitation, renewable energy, responsible consumption, and therefore maintaining life below water and life on land, or preserving ecosystems as we know it. Right? So naturally in architecture, this plays a big role because we'll be looking at materials, we'll be looking at how they can be recycled, how they can be put back into the loop, so to speak. Right? So some examples, in this case of a building that's made out of recycled plastic water bottles that then becomes a facade element, right, along with all the properties of translucency and lightness. And also recycled furniture in this case with agricultural waste, as well as fashion waste from PET. Right? So that's basically employing, in this case, recycled materials and then putting things back into the loop as far as we can. Right? Reaching the end now. So basically urban harmony, the identity and response to the site, right? Things we learned in Architecture 101 and looking at what it means for communities, right? Of course, this would need to be carefully studied in the event of COVID-19 or an equivalent pandemic. So sustainable cities and communities, right? How we can integrate, in this case, living and how we can integrate community spaces in what is otherwise private homes. I'll focus a little bit more on this, health and well-being, right? So there are a lot of parallel exercises that are happening as we speak. SIA is working together with a study with URA and JTC on what a new typology or a new design for dormitories could actually be, right? Given what's happening with the migrant workers in Singapore, right? But on a larger sort of a scope, we're looking at health and well-being as physiological and psychological wellness, right? So bringing with it aspects of biophilia and what a sustainable living environment could actually be. So the metrics would be predictive mean votes on what, in this case, what you would define as thermal comfort or good indoor air quality, for instance, right? And also percentage of people dissatisfied. We'll be looking at accessibility. We'll be looking at, the risks that a building, that an unhealthy building would also bring to bear. So the measurables would be the quotients, in this case for biophilia, comfort, inclusiveness, and safety. An example, again, this may or may not be the best example, but it is a drive, in this case, more than 10 years ago towards, first of all, bringing natural landscapes up into, well, occupiable environments, but also visual access to greens and choices of materials as well, which in this case will give you a feeling of returning back to nature. Another example would be in a hospital where every ward is allowed access to an outdoor deck or with outdoor planting. And for end-of-life patients or for terminally ill patients, right, we'll still preserve their dignity and allow them, I would say, or schedule visits to spas and so on to preserve their health for as long as still humanly possible. And finally, adaptability and longevity, right? Clearly having flexible buildings in this case is a necessary approach to any pandemic, right? Where you could retrofit buildings almost immediately for healthcare, right? And also for evacuation as necessary, right? But it also includes aspects of conservation and aspects, in this case, of heritage, right? So examples would be, again, maintaining buildings as it were where necessary and only building new forms where absolutely required. So in this case, a new glass block that is sandwiched between two existing heritage buildings and having the experience be continuous. And in the case of a furniture showroom, which this building is, right, create that differentiation between old and new as necessary. Also preservation of structure, in this case, preserving the 10-story structure of a 1970s building, right, and only building up on top as necessary, as opposed to creating a whole lot of construction waste and also construction costs by demolishing and, you know, creating or developing a brand new 12-story building. So there we go, the 7 environmental design guidelines by SIA. And just a quick note, if you've enjoyed the icons, if you've enjoyed the logos, they were actually designed by SIA President Chi Huang. So he's good for many things, including logo design. Something to take note of. Right? So these logos, or these 7 EDGs would play their part, you know, potentially multiple times across the entire project timeline and building lifecycle. So more on that in the book as well. Okay. Being very mindful of the time, in the next 5 minutes, I'll share with you the latest endeavor by the SIA Sustainability Committee. I have, in this case, the opportunity or the benefit to credit architect Xiao Zixiang, if he's on the call, right, who drove this process together with Quan Chi Yong, our committee advisor. So the idea was to, first of all, participate in a competition by the Arcasia Committee for Green and Sustainable Architecture, right, on what the new green building would be in the fight against COVID-19. And it became quite an extensive thought exercise of the causality, in this case, not of the disease necessarily, we aren't all healthcare experts, but the causality of the spread. And I think the rich-poor divide that's happening internationally has a lot to do with this. So it becomes an economic problem, obviously, because the 1% or the have-nots would then have to settle with, you know, shanty areas, slums, and so on, where spread could be more rife, right? And then there's also a discussion where, you know, even in the slums, they have their own economies, and it's not necessarily because they're poor, right? It's because it's become an ecosystem in its own right in the case of some slums. But anyways, also looking at the building typology as a naturally ventilated forum, in this case, the Dewan, which is a Sanskrit and then a Malay word for a public hall, right? So this typology we thought could be a relevant, adaptable typology as well, for first of all, the containment of people, but also I suppose, in this case, while COVID-19 isn't airborne just as yet, right? Also the ventilation, which could remove vectors of spread. So in this case, a prototype where in this case, the prototype building would be modular, would have sufficient access for both evacuation and in the event that it becomes a medical facility for quick access as well. And some of the guidelines would, of course, be mid-height in the case of seismic resistance, this being a global model potentially, right? And the facade design also being naturally ventilated with sufficient flexible spaces, in this case, the roof, for use as well during non-pandemic times. right? And the spaces within, because you're gridded, could actually be closed off with its own air circulation systems, with its own program and so on, with an effective and efficient circulation system as well, right? So in closing, right, this is one of the last slides. This is a project that is guided by the 7 EDGs, right? It would contain at different points in time one or more of the environmental design guidelines. And here's an example where it's become a rooftop farm for food resiliency, as well as in-house, in this case, healthcare facilities with access to the broader healthcare infrastructure, right, in any given city. So climate change is the larger and longer term problem, right? COVID-19 serves as a bit of a wake-up call to us. And unfortunately, it's also brought to light, I think, the unpreparedness of the world in such a scenario, right? So as architects, we do have agency over this process. We can't control policy necessarily, but we can drive positive change. The rich-poor divide, number 2, has led us to saturated communities, which are hotbeds for disease spread of any sort. Urban sprawl is not necessarily the solution, as it's at the expense of natural habitats and also natural ecosystems, right? Which again, once a tipping point is hit, we'll see a new form of disaster. One solution then is the creation of modularized buildings that are adaptable, and these need to respect and respond to nature as well as future changes. And what we therefore propose is a new day one or a new hall, public hall typology, which would be naturally ventilated. So it's our responsibility, therefore, to ensure that they can be safe and they can be used for decades and decades to come. And here's a little bit of an appeal that sustainable buildings do, in fact, have significant agency in the fight against a global pandemic, right? And we all do have a part to play. So on to the book launch, but before that, Ben, who's authored the book with input again from the Sustainability Committee as well as council members, right? We've had a good eye coming in from Catherine as well, who gave a bit of editing to it. We've also had a very good input from the rest of the council members, as well as Chi Yong, our advisor for the committee, and Chi Huang, who basically made this possible in the first place through championing this. All right, so over to you, Ben, after which we will then launch the book.
Sure, thanks. I'll just share my screen and get it to work, hopefully. Okay. Right. Okay, thanks very much. Well, it'll probably take another 15-20 minutes before we get to the book launch, to be honest. So I hope everyone's got their cup of coffee, and we'll take you on a whirlwind tour of the Green Book. So actually, writing this was a bit of a roller coaster, because at first you got the excitement, this is going to be really good, you know, all the positive experiences that we had as a committee, going through the brainstorming, building on the 11 attributes, etc. Then came to the startling realization, well, we all know it, but when you start going through the data, especially the amount of CO2 that we have in our atmosphere right now, and year-on-year builds, and realizing that all the IPCC models are actually very much best case, and we have less than their 12 years that they said, and it's closer to 7 before we hit 1.5 degrees global average. So that was when you start to hit rock bottom and think, what's the bloody point? But then things went up again, because when we started to package the book together and we had the call for the SIA competition entries and winners to populate the book through their imagery, again, it brought back that spark of joy of, you know, we have some absolutely wonderful, incredible architecture and buildings here in Singapore of such a talented fraternity, and it really brought the book to life. So I kind of ended it on a high, although it doesn't disturb the underlying message of we really do need to do something. So the book, in many ways, it really is the cornerstone of our profession's transformation in terms of looking at the deep sociological crisis of the Anthropocene age in which we're in, and it positions our profession as one that is both aware and engaged with the development goals, with the new urban agenda, which are globally recognized, but also with international environmental law, understanding what's going on there in terms of global agreements and how that can impact us in future, as well as changes in the finance community. And beyond just being aware and engaged, it's more important that we actually start to have a really coordinated action and response to all of this, you know, and that's where the EDGs come in as a way of having a template to say, look, this is how we as architects can demonstrate that we are actually pivoting importantly to really addressing some of the key issues that are at stake. And finally, the book is also positioned not just for, you know, our fraternity to look at, but for others to reference and say, you know what, the architects in Singapore really, beyond just looking at some of the buildings, really understand the issues and have a role to play in the wider solutions rather than just individual projects. And that goes to co-creation of policy, that goes to, you know, international aid, that goes to many other aspects. And it helps us communicate our value better as well, because that's really important. As a fraternity, we do communicate our value. So I'm going to take you through what's in the book. So the first section is the professional response. So here it kind of goes, well, these are the EDGs. So it gives us a call to action that we must adopt, you know, a radically different paradigm to address the challenges, and we have the responsibility to do so. You know, and it links with the ITM, which is critical. It links with the PMF, it links with the scope of services, and all the other practice level guidance. So this book, although it can be read as a standalone, it really links to the whole suite of initiatives that SIA are producing out, which is anchored by the ITM. And then we come on to the EDGs. And I'm not going to spend too long on these because Hann's done a very good job of going through them. But again, these are the way that we engage, contextualize, and respond to those global drivers. And it defines our role in implementing these internationally agreed frameworks, but it translates them to our practice rather than leaving them at high-level motherhood statements. The guidelines themselves, as highlighted, give practical guidance for implementation. They give metrics and measurables. They are not a rating tool, but they do not go against a rating tool. They are the way that which we can communicate, can do, and can demonstrate and implement in our practice. You know, there's some key EDGs in there, especially post-COVID, which are critical, as already highlighted. You know, things like health and well-being, urban harmony, resource management, all of these are really critical. You know, and in the book, we put this in the first section for a reason. We wanted to say this is the action first, because there's a lot of text out there on describing the problem, including the rest of this presentation, really. So we wanted to put it up there first, say these are the actions that we will take, and these are why we'll take it. And then more of the understanding of the climate science and what's going on internationally comes beneath it. So again, I'm not going to highlight them much, but you'll see some are quite quantitative, you know, with the metrics, saying that these are the metrics that can be used to communicate performance. Some are a lot more qualitative, you know, so things like culture, heritage, very important, you know, championing our vernacular that we have, our contemporary vernacular, you know, city and nature, etc. And then some really look at both inside your practice and how you operate your practice, as well as the building, the project, and everyone that's involved in that project, from the painters, the decorators, the brickies, the contractors, you know, the designers, the surveyors, everyone within that, and of course the occupiers. So it takes that kind of approach and packages it into 6 or 7 easily digestible guidelines, really. So section 2 is the context. Now, this one here, there's a poll which has come up, which I hope you kind of engage with. This really kind of just sets the scene, like it's about just how screwed are we really in terms of looking at climate change. So, you know, the intent is not to summarize everything that's going on, because there's a bulk of information there, but it brings everyone up to date in a very concise manner of facts and figures, what's going on and where we need to be. So for example, on this one, you could remove the poll so people could see the slide. It's about to meet the Paris Agreement, which is the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the average kind of global temperature increase, which would avert total catastrophic climate change and destruction of our valuable ecosystems. You know, we would need to supply 70 to 85% of global electricity in 2050 from renewables. We're far from that. Global carbon emissions would need to fall 55% by 2030 from 2010 levels. Now, to give an example of how difficult that is, it's expected that with COVID, global emissions have only reduced 4 to 7%, you know, from 2019 levels. And that doesn't even get us to 2010 levels, of which we need a 55% reduction. So given all of this, economy slowdown and everything, it is anticipated that once you take the full 12 months, provided economies do start to move forward, we're still not getting anywhere near where we need to go. So it's a bit humbling, and we have a huge role to play in that. In fact, today's measures, which aren't being implemented globally anyway, but today's stated measures as part of the Paris Agreement would lead to an average global warming of 4 degrees Celsius. But that's not the end of the story. For us in Singapore, we'll be looking, and everyone in that red box, an 8 degrees Celsius average. And that would be catastrophic for this region. Food yields would be down 50%. And with this area having the growing population, it means even more prime forest would have to be destroyed just to accommodate the falling food yields and things like that. So it's a very precarious situation in which we are in. And the built environment, you know, contributes greatly to it. And I don't think we need to talk too much about, you know, the 40% contribution to equivalent carbon emissions. You know, and our cities, you know, 9 out of 10 residents are breathing polluted air. So from a health perspective, that's pretty terrible. 1 out of 4 urban dwellers globally live in slums. Again, that's not really where humanity should be at. But our cities still are, you know, massive consumers of energy, producers of emissions, whilst they take up minimum land area. So there is a case to ruralize the urban and urbanize the rural to balance this off in potential ways. You know, we spend a lot of time in our buildings. There's a lot of finite resources that go into them. So how can we ensure our supply chains look at those more holistically? The World Bank just released a very useful bit of guidance on that, looking at mining and mineral extraction to power our future economies, including that transition to renewables that is needed. So there we go. Now moving on to something which is very important, which is framing the context through international environmental law. We're very good at particular aspects of law, be it co-compliance, be it contracts and things like that. But when we start to frame it out to global agreements, this is where architects really have a role to play. And in fact, we have a greater role to play than I think many other professionals. And I really think that we should start to do that. And I hope this book kind of gives an understanding of what's going on and will help us pull a seat at the table going forward as a profession in arms. So first of all, the Paris Agreement. Everyone touts that, oh, the Paris Agreement 1.5 and things like that. Not many people actually have read it or even understand what's in it. I'm not going to go through it in any detail because it's in the book, so you can pick up a copy and have a read. But one of the key aspects in there is that it actually gives the ability to legally address loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate. So that means if, for example, a neighbor country is doing something they shouldn't be doing, there is an international framework which can be used, and that is being used more and more. And eventually this will come into, you know, built environment projects, infrastructure projects, and of course, was the architect giving discharging their duty of care on it, given the climate science there. So these things may not be, affecting us directly yet, but there is potential that they would, and we should have a hand in shaping them and be aware of them. This leads on to the UN Global Pact. Again, I really, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but the thing I will highlight is that it does turn things into a human right. So it'll be the first, once it's ratified, the first global piece of legislation which says that environmental rights are human rights. And with them being human rights, it means that a lot of the work that we do is not just harming environmental issues, but if that's seen as a basic human right, we could be seen as actually interfering with that. And again, there are degrees of accountability that may happen in future given our professional position. So finance, I'm really not going to go too much into this. Again, looking at time, I think interaction is very important. The book has a chapter on this which looks more than TCFDs, but I think it's important here to highlight that the finance industry is changing. I was at a conference last year in the States where actually they have very little regulation on this, and they're crying out for professional regulation on investments, especially regarding infrastructure and buildings. But globally, there has been more of a kind of a framework that's been put out. And importantly for us in Singapore, the Singapore Monetary Authority or regulator has agreed to the principles outlined in the TCFDs, which will then have effects on how things are valued, the risks applied to valuation and to worth of assets and things like that. So again, this kind of helps our cause if we're able to communicate it to our developers, to our clients, to purchasers, and again establish what good should actually look like in terms of that to minimize risks at this stage, especially regard to value and finance. COVID has already seen that house prices and things have gone down, but will we see with climate change the same thing happening? And what about degrees of liability, not necessarily for us, but for other professions? Okay, moving on to frameworks. So globally, there are a number of frameworks. New Urban Agenda is one. And again, this is something that the Green Book and our EDGs directly addresses to say, we agree to this. We're not going to disagree to this, but this, as architects, this is how you implement it into the urban sphere. This is how you implement it in the built environment, okay? The UN Sustainable Development Goals have been highlighted again, lovely icons, developers are using them more and more. Lovely, great motherhood statements, great sentiment, and I think they are a wonderful, wonderful thing to bring everyone together. And the EDGs, again, as presented, really bring all of these and translate it to our professional practice. So again, instead of us having all the little square icons, we can use the circle icons, which have been brilliantly designed to say, look, our building does this, and by doing that, we translate that we are meeting the intent of a number of these SDGs. Of course, recently, locally, there was a chapter of the Construction Industry Declares. Again, these are lovely sentiments and I think a very important pivot to say, look, there is a crisis. And within that, there's also a part that says, we will do this. And our EDGs, again, we've mapped them in the Green Book to say, this is actually how you turn those statements of intent into your actual day-to-day practice and projects. So again, it kind of links, and it's a thread which pulls it all together into our professional sphere. Now, it wouldn't be much of a book if it didn't have a critical reflection. We can't say that everything in it is absolutely perfect and the EDGs will solve everything in life. They won't. We really looked at the question, are we engaging with the right frameworks? Do the EDGs go far enough? Are we as a profession going far enough? And even the term, should we use sustainable or environmental, or are both terms actually have so much baggage these days that they shouldn't be used? So basically, minimizing that, we start off with a critique to say that, our profession, and you can read it here, it is so complicit in sustaining multiple drivers of Earth system destruction and injustice and things like that. Our professional practice to date, although we've solved many of the world's issues, we've had great feats of pulling people out of poverty, creating health and safety, wonderful environments to live, work and play. But, you know, we are part of the Earth system destruction, and there is a growing public resistance to the business as usual approach. And I think this is something we do need to look at honestly and say, okay, what can we change in small steps, but what can we then look as a profession, both locally and globally, you know, longer term, where should we be moving to? And I think this crisis has given a good one in terms of COVID. You know, crisis. What crisis when it comes to climate change? It's a lot of posturing, a lot of discussion, but then it always comes down to, well, how much is it going to cost extra? Well, I think we should. With COVID, it hasn't been how much is it going to cost extra. It's how much is it going to cost socially if we don't do this now, and that includes slowing the economy. It would have been unimaginable to ground or prevent so much tourism and flights going on. You know, imagine saying, oh, global warming this year, we've hit our carbon cap, we shouldn't do any more flights. It wouldn't have stood. But as soon as we had a pandemic like COVID, it's, yeah, we're grounding flights because we're not traveling. So it's absolutely excellent that, you know, it shows that we do have a way of collective responsible action. And it's just a shame that it's taken a pandemic such as this to do it, because the cost of this is too high, in my opinion, to get those blue skies and extra bits of flora and fauna. The cost is too high. So this should be a business as usual going forward, but obviously in a way which we can grow an economy and build it back better. In terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, are they actually the unsustainable development goals when you look at it? So is this really the right framework to look at? Because it is used to legitimize our human-centric approach and look at, let's grow the economy, let's try this, let's try that, which is a reality. It is. So maybe we need to go, we'll engage with them. We think they're right. There's something superb which we do need to engage with, but perhaps going forward we need to think a little bit more holistically, and that's something I understand that the ITM with Catherine leading it is looking at as well. So those fundamental questions. But that being said, we must engage with them as a profession. We must. Otherwise we'll just be that quiet voice in the corner, you know, stamping our feet. We need to be there front and center, and that's where the EDGs have been positioned to translate them to our practice. So instead of saying, oh, we'll meet this SDG, we're saying, no, in the built environment, we are the custodians. This is how this SDG intent is being met. So we are doing it. And then finally, I'd like to end with the kind of conclusion that we had, and the picture you see is very, very purposeful, as you can see, and that was one of our lovely projects at Sparkle Tots by Lord Architect. So again, it's a wonderful project, and this photo I think captures everything, because what we're talking about now and what's impacting us now is going to impact them who are experiencing our built environment a lot more than it's doing us. So, you know, as a profession, I really think, and I would put it to all of us as professional architects, we do need to make a professional stand. The environmental principles that are outlined in the Green Book, along with the context, which hopefully gives a bite-sized overview of many of the global Pacts, Acts, frameworks, which people will cite, but not many people know about, and will give us much greater knowledge of that, will actually cement our action. And we need to acknowledge that, you know, we have professional duties and responsibilities, and they will change as international law changes, as science changes, and so we need to be cognizant of that. And I guess my final 2 points would be, number one, I would say we cannot preserve the status quo. If we do, as a profession, we will need to be comfortable with and accept the responsibilities that come with the decision that we are preserving the root cause of the socio-ecological crisis in which we find ourselves in today. And finally, that although the book and this presentation is a lot of words, and words alone can't change behavior, better words can prompt better behavior, and the EDGs will help with that. So, you know, this book, the guidelines, when read together with the ITM and everything else, really pushes for our profession to have a much more ambitious framework as a means for our practice to address head-on some of the systematic challenges that are ahead of us, and more than that, be the solution providers. And that's critical, the solution providers to become a more socially, ecologically sound and socially just and a healthy world, which impacts everyone. And just look at this picture if that doesn't make you want to do it. So that's the end of the presentation. On to the launch, I believe.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ben. I think it has been quite a journey. I think if anything, trying to find the right content to make it concise enough and to have everyone pick it up, right, and apply it to practice, right. At this point, and being again very mindful of the very few minutes that we have left, I'd like to invite Chi Huang to say a couple of words about the book before we launch it virtually. SIA President, please.
Yeah, thank you, Architect Hann and Architect Ben Towells. So dear members of SIA and friends of Arcasia, so it's good afternoon and hope you're all keeping well. So it's truly an honor today to welcome all of you to the launch of SIA's Green Book and share our excitement, I think collectively as the council, about this event and this very special project. I think just a bit of thoughts. Some may ask, why a Green Book? And why did we spend close to 2 years on of this nature? So I thought I'll share through 3 key subjects that I think the team constantly repeat to keep us on track. It's really about commitment, alignment, and action. So in terms of commitment, this idea of a SIA Green Book, it marks our institute continuous commitment towards creating more sustainable and responsible design. Right, it's really true, minimizing the negative environmental impacts of building, that we find that it's one of the most tangible and most direct way we can help in this endeavor. And in fact, this endeavor started in 2011 with SIA's 11 attributes of sustainable environment that was championed by then SIA President Architect Ashwin Kumar. And I think, if I'm not wrong, at that point, the Sustainable Committee team was led by Architect Chung Yu Ki. So this drive for sustainable design is one of the core pillars in our SIA's ITM industry transformation map that also strategically charts how sustainability and the design capability that comes with it and the practice that we are advocating will also elevate our relevance and resilience. So today's launch really signifies that next page in this pursuit. Next, on alignment, as Ben and Zehan have shared, it is designed to complement our national green mark rating, green building rating, and collectively look at elevating performance of building and reducing negative impact. And strategically, the 7 EDGs also advocated within the publication are also benchmarked, as Ben said, against larger global kind of aspiration, the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But more importantly, it internationalizes Singapore's own value system in terms of looking at green. Hence, these aspects of how we look at strengthening both human and planetary health in our endeavors. So this alignment is timely, as many have shared. So COVID-19 pandemic, through its devastating effects, have also served as a very powerful reminder of cause and effects. Just 2 days ago, I think many of you may have read in Guardian and Washington Post, they've also published this part of forced lockdowns in cities have effectively contributed to an estimated 17% decline in daily global carbon dioxide emission. Right? But scientists have surmised this as the largest worldwide drop in recorded history. And this correlation between environmental degradation and human consumption is clear as water. But importantly, scientists have also highlighted that even with such drastic measure, the drop is far from the target, as the team has shared, in terms of what we are aspiring in the Paris Climate Agreement. Behavioral change is not enough. We need structural changes, and that's to the economy, to the industry, and to our practice. And this is the opportunity for us to put forth some of these structural changes to fight the bigger crisis of climate change. And that comes to the last point of action. And as the word crisis, I've shared this before, in Greek, it actually means decision. And in fact, in Chinese, it means opportunity. And that change begins with all of us through our daily actions. So the SIA Green Book highlights our responsibility as architects to exercise mindfulness of this interdependent ecosystem. And through our guidelines and matrix and measurables, we hope to push for actions to tackle the bigger crisis at hand. And of course, with that, ultimately, the aim is to increase stock of low carbon and zero or high performance buildings while reducing consumption. Last but not least, in closing, just wanted to take the opportunity to extend heartfelt gratitude to the green champions and heroes really behind the book. So on behalf of SIA, we are truly grateful to the team members, especially that of the Sustainability Committee, Chair, of course, Architect Hann, Deputy Chair, Architect Sunny Chong, Advisor, Architect Kwan Chi Yong, members, Architect Yi Chan, as well as Architect Xiao Zhixiang, Architect S.T. Lim, and of course, Miss Chang Yen Lin. And last but not least, not to forget, important, our author, Architect Ben Towers. Kudos to all of you for this amazing project. And equally to all our members and friends of SIA, thank you for your continuous support and participation. Enjoy the Green Book. Cool thing is a free copy will be extended to all SIA members via our websites or Apex. And then for members of Acacia, we look forward to extending a complimentary copy to all of you in our next Acacia gathering. So we hope the Green Book will aid you in driving transformation by design for a better tomorrow. So with this, on behalf of the 59th Council of SIA, I officially launch our SIA Green Book. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Chi Huang. So at this point, Ben, if you could share the cover image or the page of the book to convince everyone that it does exist. And yes, it does exist. There's a link to actually have a preview copy of the book. Please note that this copy is a pre-ISBN registered copy of the book, so it's a bootleg copy. Right? And for the actual the ISBN registered copy, the content I promise you will exactly be the same. That will be the SIA website and will also be distributed to the relevant Arcasia channels in our future event to come, virtual or otherwise. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone. While the book is being virtually projected onto your screens, I think now's a good time for Q&A. Any questions from the members of the audience? There's been a couple that's been addressed.
Zhan, there's a question in the Q&A.
Okay, hold on a second. The one I saw was from architect Naranjan. So he asked about the possible metrics for psychological wellness. So there are several different standards, right? The recognized ones would be the IEEE standards, and there are various scales of measurement of wellness. A lot of that is tied to the self-actualization or the self-satisfaction Maslowian pyramid of needs as well. Yeah, so you could look a little bit more into that too. Yeah. As it is, we haven't drawn a direct correlation or a direct link between that and architecture, right? But that in the years to come would probably become fairly significant, you know, with, and it's not just a new age craze, you know, you might think the well rating or the wellness aspects are just, you know, new age, healthy living kinds of things. But increasingly, I think we're becoming conscious that buildings do in fact have a heavy impact on mental health. And if you don't believe me, you know, there will be multiple cases, I think, of mental health issues, not only as a result of being locked down, but as a result also of the environments, the immediate environment you find yourself in.
Okay, I think Darren saw a message.
Darren, directed to Ben.
yeah.
It's in the chat, yeah.
Yeah, so I can address that. When I'm screen sharing, I can't really see much of the chat. Oh no, Q&A, there we go. Okay, right, where was it? Okay, yes, when you start on the daunting journey of authoring the Green Book, yes, it was daunting. Health and safety fully considered through the project life. Yes, it is. Should this have addressed building typologies to mitigate viral transmissions in pandemic situations? I think the EDG now would encapsulate that, because we are talking about a new normal. So it explicitly, when we talk about health and safety throughout the project lifecycle, I think now would need to include things such as this. I think it is a vital part of that EDG, and maybe not explicit within it, but there are aspects of the book which deal with COVID and relate it back to pandemics as a whole. So I think, you know, we all learn quickly, and SARS was one aspect which was learned quickly, and that's why Singapore did relatively well here, as did Hong Kong and other parts. So I think that, yeah, within that EDG, making sure that a pandemic response is captured is part of that whole of life perspective.
All right, there's another question as well from architect Jayanta. Thank you so much for joining us. Right, so his question is, what are the relations of this book with the Green Mark rating system? In my point of view, the Green Mark is a larger and broader system that engenders different aspects of the built environment, right? So it covers multiple aspects of the building industry, and that includes engineering, that of course includes construction and operations and facilities management. What the guidelines try to do is to, rather what the SIA environmental design guidelines try to do is to bring that process back into the design of things, into the architecture of things, and how we as stewards, or as I'd say, the vanguard of the profession, as we like to think ourselves to be, how we can actually take that on and map against Green Mark, and map in parallel with Green Mark what the architectural aspects of designing for green buildings actually would be. Yeah. So the short answer to that would be yes, it exists, it coexists with Green Mark. It maps onto it as well, right? Downstream exercises would include, you know, mapping the exact metrics again that, you know, if you actually, in Singaporean terms, you know, you get 3 points, you know, if you actually fulfill the guidelines and at the same time achieve the Green Mark points. Yeah. So the same would be said, of course, for LEED and the multiple other international green ratings.
Yeah, I would caution the fact that, and say that I mean, the intent is it's not a rating tool. This is about professional practice and professional response and how you do it. So, you know, we have talked about metrics and measurables, which is important, and some of those are intangible, qualitative, and you know, very important from that, which rating tools may or may not include. So it's not in conflict, and as Hann says, it's actually something quite positive, because by following the EDGs, you'll likely do quite well in a rating tool. But it's not to say if I tackle one EDG that translates to 6 points, 7 points, 8 points. That everyone has different ways of measuring things. We're looking at, this is the metric, this is professional practice, this is how you actually champion it as a whole.
All right, is there any final question to take live, anyone? I saw a couple of raised hands earlier. Right, before that, there's another one in the Q&A. Will this, from architect Shohina from Nepal, greetings, all the way from Nepal. Will this book help to fulfill a guide to planning a healthy and environmentally friendly home? The quick answer to that is yes. For all the reasons that were described in the past hour. All right, so I guess we've come to a close for this seminar. It's slightly past 1 now. Thank you for spending, in many cases, especially for the Singapore attendees, thank you for spending the lunch hour with us, right? And hopefully this will become one of the several of the many SIA publications that will continue to guide you and guide us towards a better, more equitable, and also hopefully successful practice. Yeah. for architecture. At this point, I'd like to thank architect Lin Chung Kiang, right, the chair of the Education Thrust, for first of all proposing and then successfully carrying out a series of hashtag SIA United or SIA Cares series of seminars, right? So these are lunchtime seminars that happen every Tuesday and Thursday. There are several more to come, right? So more details can be shared. I think Secretariat, you can share those on screen as well. The next one is, of course, by architect Chong Yu-Ki, one of the original team members behind the earlier 11 attributes that was talked about. So Yu-Ki will be sharing again on next Tuesday, I believe.
All right. Just a quick primer. Can you hear me? For the next week, Tuesday, the topic is called wellness. It's meant to provoke rather than to prescribe. So central to it is how architecture should respond to the externalities of this pandemic and COVID. And two propositions are made. So with the present CB, how is work, live and play affects what we do now, that is in our home, versus where we wish to be, which is in the office. Now this affects wellness. And the second proposal is how this disease or the virus is transmitted, prevented, and how any social intervention vis-a-vis stay-at-home, social distancing are creating psychological distress. And now then we create spaces to mitigate this. So I'll be sharing this with you next week. Thank you.
Yeah, so in response to the earlier question from architect Naranjan, so this would be a good session to tune in as well, yeah, on wellness. And finally, I think the next phase, what's beyond this book, right, is not an end all. In fact, it launches a series of activities, and also in response to architect Rida Razak's question. So my friend from Malaysia, thank you for joining. So his question is basically, will the guideline be a possible tool to rate architectural projects aligning to the SDGs and the new urban agenda? The quick answer is, again, yes, it is a possibility, but not in conflict with the existing green rating, which we're already bogged down with in Singapore. And the idea is for the next phase of the book to take on a digital form, not in fact that it is a PDF, but in the way that it could be cross-linked or hyperlinked to a series of online tools, right? So the SIA architects, you can sort of allude that to maybe like the fee calculator, which Darren Benjer, who is also here, which he authored. So tools like that are simple to understand, tools that are simple to sort of pull out and then evaluate what is qualitative into becoming something that ultimately is quantitative, right? And hopefully that will also generate enough traction that it becomes a way for us architects to also convince our clients that, hey, all these are in fact quantifiable aspects that, you know, you could put a man-hour fee to, for instance.
Yeah, and also, you know, as mentioned, the Green Book, the EDGs, it all links to that overarching professional practice and professionalism that we have. And so we have the SIA Scope of Service Matrix, so expect an update to that as well, which would include these key environmental EDGs being overlapped with that of what to consider when and things. So it really helps communicate our position. It's not to say architects don't know what they're doing at all. It's to actually help us communicate and make and raise that value proposition higher.
Okay, once again, I would like to thank our president, architect Szue Huang, for launching the book. And we'd like to thank our speaker, architect Hann and Benjamin Towell, for the wonderful presentation and also the hard work that they put in. Just a little bit of announcement. So the video of today's session will be available on SIA website from this Friday onwards. And the Green Book can be downloaded from SIA website as well. And I continue to encourage you to participate in our coming webinar series from next 2 weeks on Tuesday and Thursday. So once again, thanks for your participation, and look forward to meet you again in the coming webinars.
Thank you, everyone.
Would you like to say
Thank
something?
you.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Han. Thank you, Ben.
No
Good
worries.
stuff.